The wire was nothing more than rusted concertina strung between rotting posts, but crossing it meant everything. Dinah Koroma lay flat against the jungle floor, her rifle tucked beneath her body, watching the compound through a gap in the undergrowth no wider than her fist. 40 meters ahead, a man with an AK slung across his back urinated against the side of a wooden structure. He had been standing there for nearly 2 minutes. She counted his breaths by the rise and fall of his shoulders and matched her own to his rhythm. The logging camp had been converted into something between a fortress and a prison. 3 long buildings formed a U shape around a central clearing where a fire pit smoldered with dying embers. Generator cables snaked between structures, and a single floodlight mounted on a crooked pole cast harsh shadows across the mud. She counted 11 hostiles in her initial scan. The intelligence briefing had estimated 8 to 10. Already the numbers were working against her. The man finished and walked back toward the largest building, disappearing through a doorway covered by a hanging tarp. Dinah waited another 60 seconds before she moved. The jungle had taught her patience years ago during her first deployment, and she had never forgotten the lesson. Rushing killed more soldiers than bullets ever did. She rose to a crouch and crossed to the wire in 4 quick strides, her boots finding the firm ground she had identified during her approach. The concertina had a gap near the eastern post where the wire had been poorly secured. She dropped flat again, worked her rifle through first, then followed on her belly. A barb caught her sleeve and she froze, feeling the fabric stretch but not tear. She exhaled slowly and continued through. Inside the wire now. The words repeated in her mind like a cadence. Inside the wire. No extraction. No support. No margin for error. She moved along the tree line that bordered the compound's eastern edge, staying low, letting the shadows swallow her silhouette. The first sentry she encountered was leaning against a palm tree, his rifle propped beside him, his attention fixed on a cell phone screen that cast blue light across his face. He never heard her approach. She was behind him in 3 heartbeats, her knife doing the work that her rifle could not do quietly. He slumped against the tree, and she eased him to the ground, positioning his body to look like he was sleeping. Someone would discover him eventually, but she needed minutes, not hours. The hostages were being held in the northernmost building according to the intercepted radio traffic. She circled wide, avoiding the fire pit and the cluster of insurgents who sat around it passing a cigarette between them. Their voices carried across the clearing in a language she did not understand, but their laughter needed no translation. They were relaxed, confident. They had no idea that the perimeter had already been breached. Dinah reached the back wall of the northern building and pressed her ear against the wooden slats. Voices inside, but faint. A man coughing. The rattle of chains. She moved along the wall until she found a gap between boards wide enough to see through. The sight inside stopped her breath. 3 figures sat against the far wall, their hands bound behind them, hoods covering their heads. 2 wore the camouflage pattern of Philippine Marines. The 3rd wore civilian clothes stained dark with what could only be blood. But it was the 4th figure that made her stomach clench. He lay motionless on the floor, no hood, no bindings, his eyes open and staring at nothing. She recognized the contractor from the mission briefing photos. Garrett Solis, 42 years old, former Marine, 2 children back in San Diego. They had killed him already. The rescue had come too late for at least one of them. Dinah closed her eyes and forced the grief down into the place where she kept all the things she could not afford to feel during a mission. There would be time for anger later, time for sorrow. Right now, there were 3 people still alive who needed her to stay focused. She counted the guards inside the building. 2 stationed at the door. 1 sitting in a chair near the hostages, an AK across his lap. 3 total in the structure. Manageable if she could isolate them from the others outside. The sound of engines broke the silence. Dinah dropped flat against the wall as headlights swept through the compound. A vehicle was approaching from the western road, its engine growling through the darkness. She watched as a truck emerged from the jungle and rolled to a stop near the fire pit. Men climbed from the cab and the bed, at least 6 more fighters, and suddenly the numbers had doubled. The insurgent commander stepped out from the largest building to greet the new arrivals. He was shorter than she expected, with a thick beard and a voice that carried authority even at a distance. She watched him embrace one of the men from the truck, then gesture toward the northern building where the hostages waited. She did not need to understand his words to know what that gesture meant. They were accelerating the timeline. Whatever execution they had planned for dawn was moving up. The new arrivals had brought either orders or impatience, and either one meant the same thing for the people chained inside that building. Dinah pressed her back against the wall and looked up at the stars visible through the canopy. 17 hostiles now minimum. 3 hostages still breathing. 1 rifle. 67 rounds. And somewhere in the jungle behind her, the rest of her team was still pinned down, fighting their own battle, unaware that everything had just changed. She thought about her brother. She thought about the promise she had made standing over his grave in Providence, the rain soaking through her dress uniform, her mother's hand gripping hers so tight it left bruises. She had promised she would never let fear stop her from doing what was right. She had promised she would be brave enough for both of them. The insurgent commander finished his conversation and began walking toward the northern building. Dinah Koroma checked her rifle, counted her magazines one more time, and began to move. The commander was 15 meters from the building when Dinah made her decision. She could not fight 17 men in a straight engagement. She could not slip away and leave 3 people to die. She could not call for help that would never arrive in time. But she could change the shape of the problem. The generator sat behind the largest building, its diesel engine chugging steadily, feeding power to the single floodlight that illuminated the compound. She had marked its position during her approach. 40 meters from her current location, separated by open ground and at least 4 armed men. Impossible to reach without being seen. But the fuel cans stacked beside it were a different matter. She pulled the 1 fragmentation grenade from her vest and weighed it in her palm. 1 grenade, 1 chance to create chaos. If she missed, if the explosion failed to ignite the fuel, she would have announced her position to every fighter in the compound with nothing to show for it. The commander reached the door of the northern building and pushed aside the tarp. She heard him bark orders in Tagalog, heard the guards inside respond. Through the gap in the boards, she watched one of them yank the hood off the first Philippine Marine. The young man blinked against the sudden light, his face bloodied and swollen, but his eyes were defiant. He said something to the commander that earned him a backhand across the jaw. Dinah did not have time to plan. She had time to act. She moved along the back of the building, staying low, using the shadows. The generator was directly across the compound now, visible between the structures. The men around the fire pit were distracted by the new arrivals, sharing stories and cigarettes, their weapons held loosely or set aside entirely. She would have maybe 3 seconds between throwing the grenade and the explosion, 3 seconds to reposition before everything erupted. She found a gap between the northern building and the structure beside it, barely wide enough for her shoulders. From here, she had a clear line to the generator and the fuel can stacked in red plastic containers beside it. She pulled the pin, let the spoon fly, counted 1 heartbeat, and threw. The grenade arced through the darkness, a black shape against the stars, and for a terrible moment, she thought she had thrown too far. Then it landed with a metallic clang against one of the fuel cans, and the world turned to fire. The explosion ripped through the generator and ignited the fuel in a cascade of orange and red. A fireball climbed into the night sky, and the floodlight died instantly, plunging the compound into chaos. Men screamed. Someone was burning, running blind through the clearing, his clothes engulfed. Others dove for cover or scrambled for weapons they had set aside moments earlier. Dinah was already moving. She came around the front of the northern building as the 2 guards at the door stumbled out, their eyes struggling to adjust from the light inside to the sudden darkness. She shot the first one in the chest at 5 meters. The second turned toward the sound and caught her second round through his throat. They fell together in a tangle of limbs, and she stepped over them before they stopped moving. Inside the building, the commander was shouting, "Try to regain control." The guard by the hostages had risen from his chair, his AK raised, searching for a target. Dinah came through the doorway low and fast, her rifle already aligned. She put 2 rounds center mass and watched him crumple against the wall. The commander spun toward her, reaching for the pistol at his hip. She closed the distance in 2 strides and drove the stock of her rifle into his jaw. He went down hard, the pistol skittering across the dirt floor. She hit him again to make sure he stayed down. The 3 hostages were staring at her with wide eyes, their hoods removed now, their faces masks of disbelief. The Philippine Marine she had watched get struck was trying to speak, his words coming out in broken fragments that might have been English or Tagalog or simply shock given voice. Dinah knelt beside the first hostage and cut the ropes binding his wrists. Her knife moved quickly, efficiently, the way she had practiced hundreds of times in training. The second hostage, the third, the civilian contractor was shaking so badly he could barely stand when she pulled him to his feet. "We have to move," she said. "Stay behind me. Do exactly what I say." The Marine who had been struck found his voice. "Who are you?" She did not answer. There was no time for introductions. Outside, the chaos was beginning to organize itself. She could hear voices calling to each other, the crackle of flames from the burning generator, footsteps running through the compound. The insurgents were recovering faster than she had hoped. They would be searching for whoever had attacked them within moments. Dinah led the hostages to the back of the building and the gap she had used before. The youngest of the 3, a Philippine Marine who looked barely 20, was limping badly. His left leg was swollen at the knee, possibly broken, definitely damaged beyond what adrenaline could mask for long. She would have to account for that in their movement. "The jungle," she said. "Stay low and follow the tree line east. Do not stop no matter what you hear." The civilian contractor grabbed her arm. "There were more of us. Garrett, he was with us yesterday, but they took him and he never came back." Dinah met his eyes and saw the desperate hope there, the prayer that his friend might still be alive somewhere in this camp. "He is gone," she said. "I am sorry. We cannot help him now, but I can still get you out if you move." The hope died in his face, but something harder replaced it. He nodded once and released her arm. She checked the compound through the gap between buildings. The fire was spreading now, jumping from the generator to a nearby structure, and several insurgents had shifted from searching to firefighting. Others were still scanning the darkness, their weapons raised, shouting questions that no one could answer. The commander she had knocked unconscious would wake eventually and tell them exactly what had happened. She needed to be deep in the jungle before that moment came. Dinah stepped into the darkness and gestured for the hostages to follow. The young Marine with the damaged leg leaned on his companion, biting back sounds of pain with every step. The civilian contractor moved like a man in a nightmare, present but not fully connected to what was happening around him. Behind them, the compound burned. Ahead of them, 12 kilometers of hostile jungle waited between this moment and safety. And somewhere in that darkness, the rest of the insurgent force would soon be hunting them. The jungle swallowed them whole. Dinah pushed through walls of vegetation that clawed at her rifle and tore at her skin, leading the 3 hostages along a route she had memorized during her infiltration. Every step away from the burning compound was a step toward survival, but every step also drained time she did not have. The young Philippine Marine with the damaged leg was slowing them down. His name was Corporal Ramos. She had learned in the brief fragments of whispered conversation they had exchanged. 23 years old, from a small fishing village outside Zamboanga. He had been captured during a routine patrol 6 days ago and had watched 2 of his squad mates die in the first 48 hours of captivity. He did not complain about the pain, but she could hear in his breathing sharp intakes through clenched teeth with every impact of his foot against the ground. His companion was Sergeant Villanueva, older and harder, a career soldier who moved through the darkness with the economy of a man who had spent years in terrain like this. He kept one arm around Ramos and the other hand on the knife Dinah had given him, his eyes scanning constantly, even though he could see almost nothing. The civilian contractor brought up the rear. His name was Mitchell Cray, a logistics specialist who had been in the country for 3 months coordinating supply deliveries between American bases and Philippine facilities. He had never fired a weapon in his life. He had admitted when she asked. He had never expected to need one. Dinah stopped at the base of a massive tree where the roots created a natural hollow. She gestured for the others to take cover and knelt beside Ramos to examine his leg. Even in the darkness, she could feel the heat radiating from his swollen knee. The joint was damaged badly, possibly a torn ligament, possibly worse. He needed medical attention within hours, not the days it would take to reach help at their current pace. "How bad?" Ramos whispered. "You'll make it," she said. It was not exactly an answer, but he nodded as if it was. She pulled her radio from her vest and tried the team frequency again. Static answered. She switched to the emergency channel and transmitted blind, giving her position and situation in clipped phrases that any American unit in range would understand. More static. The mountains and the jungle canopy were blocking everything. She was as isolated now as she had been inside the compound. Sergeant Villanueva moved close enough to speak without raising his voice above a murmur. "They will come after us. The commander, he is not the type to let prisoners escape. He will want to make an example." "I know," Dinah said. "How far to your people?" 12 kilometers. Maybe more with the terrain. Villanueva was quiet for a moment. "Ramos cannot make 12 kilometers. Not like this. Not fast enough. Then we find another way." She studied the darkness around them, thinking through the problem the way she had been trained. The insurgents would expect them to head directly toward the FOB. They would set up blocking positions along the most obvious routes and send trackers to follow their trail. Moving slowly with an injured man, they would be overtaken before dawn. But there was another option. During the mission briefing, the intelligence officer had mentioned a river that ran roughly parallel to their planned extraction route. It fed into a larger waterway that eventually passed within 3 kilometers of the FOB. If they could reach the river and find something that floated, they could cover distance without leaving a trail and without putting weight on Ramos's leg. "There is a river," she said, 2 kilometers east. "If we can reach it, we can float downstream." Villanueva considered this. "And if the river is guarded, then we deal with it." The sergeant almost smiled. "You're not what I expected when I saw you come through that door." "What did you expect?" "Someone who would hesitate." Dinah checked her rifle and chambered a fresh round. "Hesitation is a luxury. I have never been able to afford luxuries." They moved out again, angling east now, away from the direct route to safety. Ramos was struggling worse than before, his damaged leg dragging, his breathing ragged. Mitchell Cray had found some reserve of strength and moved up to help Villanueva support the younger Marine. The three of them forming a single stumbling unit that crashed through the undergrowth with all the subtlety of a wounded animal. Dinah ranged ahead, scouting the path, checking for threats, doubling back to guide them around obstacles they could not see. The jungle was alive with sounds, insects and night birds, and the rustle of creatures moving through the canopy. But beneath it all, she listened for the one sound that would mean everything had gone wrong. The sound of pursuit. It came 20 minutes into their march toward the river. Voices behind them, distant but distinct. The beam of a flashlight cutting through the trees, maybe 500 meters back. The insurgents had organized faster than she had hoped, and they were already on the trail. Dinah dropped back to the group and grabbed Villanueva's arm. "They're behind us. 1/2 kilometer. We need to move faster." Ramos heard her and tried to increase his pace. His leg buckled after 3 steps, and he went down hard, a grunt of pain escaping before he could stop it. Villanueva hauled him back up, but the damage was done. They were not going to outrun the pursuit. Not like this. She made the calculation in the space between heartbeats. For people moving slowly would be caught. One person moving fast might reach the river and bring back help. But leaving them meant leaving them defenseless, with one knife between 3 men and an enemy that would not take prisoners twice. The other calculation was simpler. She was a soldier. They were her responsibility now. She did not leave people behind. "Keep moving toward the river," she told Villanueva. "Follow the slope downhill. You will hear the water before you see it." "Where are you going?" To buy you time. She did not wait for him to argue. She turned back toward the approaching lights and melted into the jungle, becoming shadow, becoming silence, becoming the thing that waited in the darkness for men who thought they were the hunters. Behind her, Villanueva urged the others forward. Ahead of her, flashlight beams danced through the trees like fireflies made of malice. Dinah Koroma found a position behind a fallen log, settled her rifle against her shoulder, and waited for the enemy to come to her. The first man came through the trees carrying his flashlight in one hand and his rifle in the other, sweeping both in wide arcs that accomplished nothing except announcing his position to anyone with eyes. Dinah watched him from behind the fallen log, her breathing slow and controlled, her finger resting beside the trigger guard. He was maybe 25 meters out, close enough that she could see the sweat glistening on his forehead in the reflected glow of his own light. She let him pass. The second man was smarter, keeping his light pointed at the ground, following the trail of broken vegetation the hostages had left during their escape. He moved with more caution than his companion, checking his flanks, pausing to listen. A hunter who understood that the jungle held dangers beyond the obvious. He would be the first to die. She counted 6 total in the pursuit element. 6 men with rifles and lights, spread across maybe 40 meters of jungle, moving in a loose formation that prioritized speed over security. They expected to find fleeing prisoners, not a counter-ambush. That expectation would cost them. The smart one reached a point directly ahead of her position. 10 meters. She could see his face clearly now, young and hard, a scar running from his left ear to his jaw. He stopped and held up a fist, signaling the others to halt. His head turned slowly, scanning the darkness, and for a moment his eyes seemed to lock directly on the fallen log where she lay hidden. Dinah stopped breathing. The moment stretched. The man's eyes moved on, continuing their sweep, finding nothing. He lowered his fist and gestured forward. The pursuit resumed. She exhaled and raised her rifle. The first shot took the smart one through the chest. He dropped without a sound, his flashlight tumbling from his hand and spinning crazily across the jungle floor. The second shot caught the man behind him as he turned toward the sound, punching through his shoulder and spinning him into a tree. The third shot missed entirely as the remaining 4 scattered for cover, their lights going dark, their voices rising in alarm and confusion. Dinah rolled away from her position before they could pinpoint her muzzle flash. She moved 10 meters to her left and dropped behind a thick tree trunk, making herself small, listening. The wounded man was screaming somewhere in the darkness, a high keening sound that would draw his companions and mask any noise she made. The others were shouting to each other, trying to coordinate, trying to understand what had just happened. She had maybe 60 seconds before they organized. 60 seconds to reposition and strike again, or to break contact and run. Running meant leaving them able to pursue. Running meant they would catch the hostages before they reached the river. Running was not an option. She circled wide, using the screaming man as a reference point, moving through vegetation that grabbed at her legs and arms. One of the insurgents was calling out in English now, threats and promises, demanding she show herself, offering mercy she knew was a lie. She ignored the words and focused on the voice, triangulating his position from the sound. He was crouched behind a boulder, maybe 15 meters ahead, his rifle pointed in the wrong direction, still searching for her at her original position. She came up on his flank and put 2 rounds through his torso before he could turn. He slumped forward and his rifle clattered against stone. 3 down, 3 remaining. The jungle went quiet. Even the wounded man had stopped screaming, either dead or unconscious or simply too exhausted to continue. The insects had fallen silent in response to the gunfire, and the absence of their chorus made every sound seem magnified. A branch cracking, fabric brushing against leaves, the metallic click of a safety being released. Dinah froze. The click had come from behind her. She turned slowly, knowing she was too late, knowing the rifle would already be aimed at her back. The insurgent stood 5 meters away, his weapon leveled at her chest, his face twisted with rage and fear in equal measure. He was young, maybe 19, and his hand was shaking badly enough that she could see the barrel of his rifle trembling. "Drop it," he said. "Drop the gun." She calculated the odds. Raise her rifle and fire before he could pull the trigger. The distance was short, but his hands were unsteady. She might make it. She might not. If she dropped her weapon, she would be dead anyway, just slower. Her brother's face flashed through her mind. Not the way he had looked in the casket, peaceful and wrong, but the way he had looked the last time she saw him alive. 17 years old, standing on their mother's porch in Providence, waving goodbye as she left for basic training, telling her to be careful, telling her to come home. She had promised she would. The young insurgent's finger tightened on the trigger. A shot split the night, and Dinah flinched, waiting for the impact, waiting for the pain. Neither came. The insurgent's expression changed from rage to confusion to nothing at all as he collapsed forward, a dark hole visible in the side of his head. Dinah spun toward the direction of the shot and raised her rifle. A figure emerged from the jungle, moving low and fast, an American rifle held in steady hands. For a moment, she thought it was Hendricks or one of the Rangers from the assault team, somehow freed from the firefight and come to find her. Then the figure stepped into a patch of moonlight, and she saw the face clearly. Specialist Yosef Abraha stopped 3 meters away, breathing hard, his uniform torn and his face streaked with mud and something that might have been blood. "Sergeant Koroma," he said, "I thought you might need some help." The 2 remaining insurgents chose that moment to flee. She heard them crashing through the jungle, moving away, abandoning the pursuit. She let them go. Chasing them would waste time and ammunition she could not spare. "How did you find me?" she asked. Abraha allowed himself a small smile. "I followed the sound of you making bad decisions. Despite everything, despite the bodies around her and the hostages still struggling toward the river and the night that was far from over, Dinah felt something loosen in her chest. She was not alone anymore. "Come on," she said. "There are people counting on us." Together, they moved into the darkness. They found the hostages at the river's edge. Villanueva had managed to drag Ramos the final 200 meters through sheer force of will, and the young corporal now lay against a tree with his damaged leg stretched before him, his face pale even in the darkness. Mitchell Cray crouched nearby, holding the knife Dinah had given Villanueva, gripping it like a man who had never held a weapon but was prepared to try. Cray nearly lunged at them when they emerged from the tree line. Villanueva caught his arm and pulled him back, recognizing the American uniforms before the contractor could do something they would all regret. "You made it," Villanueva said. "We heard the shooting. Most of them will not be following us anymore," Dinah replied. "But there are more at the compound. We need to move." Abraha was already examining Ramos, checking the swollen knee with careful hands. The corporal winced, but did not cry out. He had moved past the point where pain could surprise him anymore. "He cannot walk," Abraha said quietly, "not without support. And the terrain ahead is worse than what we came through." Then we carry him. The river stretched before them, maybe 30 meters wide, its surface dark and smooth in the moonlight. The current moved at a walking pace, fast enough to carry them, but slow enough to control. On the far bank, the jungle continued, unbroken and impenetrable, but somewhere beyond it lay safety. Dinah scanned the shoreline and found what she was looking for. A cluster of bamboo had been cut and lashed together, probably by fishermen who used this stretch of river during the day. The raft was crude but functional, large enough to hold all 5 of them if they balanced carefully. She waded into the water and pulled the raft free from the reeds where it had been secured. The bamboo was slick beneath her hands, but the lashings held when she tested them. It would work. It had to work. "Help me get him onto this," she said. Abraha and Villanueva lifted Ramos between them while Cray steadied the raft. The corporal groaned as they lowered him onto the bamboo, his damaged leg jostling despite their care. Once he was settled, the others climbed aboard, distributing their weight as evenly as possible. The raft sank lower in the water but stayed afloat. Dinah pushed them away from the bank and climbed on last, using a broken branch she had found as a makeshift paddle. The current caught them immediately, pulling them downstream, away from the compound, away from the men who wanted them dead. For the first time since she had crossed through the wire, she allowed herself to believe they might actually survive this. The river carried them through the darkness. Dinah steered from the rear, keeping them away from rocks and fallen trees that could capsize the raft or tear it apart. Abraham watched the banks on either side, his rifle ready, searching for threats. Villanueva held Ramos steady, preventing the injured man from rolling as the raft shifted beneath them. Cray sat in the center, silent and still, his eyes fixed on something none of them could see. 20 minutes passed. 30. The jungle slid by on either side, unchanging and endless, and Dinah began to wonder if she had misjudged the distance to the FOB. The intelligence briefing had shown the river passing within 3 kilometers of the base, but maps did not always match reality, especially in terrain like this. Then she heard it. Helicopter rotors. Faint at first, almost lost beneath the sound of the river, but growing louder. She looked up and saw navigation lights moving across the stars, a pattern she recognized from 100 training exercises and a dozen deployments. American aircraft. Searching for them. She grabbed the radio from her vest and tried the emergency frequency again. The static was still there, but thinner now, broken by fragments of voice traffic that might have been words. She transmitted blind, giving their position relative to the river, describing the raft, requesting immediate extraction. The response came through like a miracle. Firefly 6, this is Warhorse. We have your position. Extraction inbound. Mark your location. Dinah dug into her vest and found her infrared strobe. She activated it and held it above her head, the invisible pulse of light painting their raft for anyone with night vision. The helicopter banked toward them, its searchlight stabbing down through the canopy, turning the river into a ribbon of silver. Then the gunfire started. Muzzle flashes erupted from the eastern bank, automatic weapons raking the water around the raft. Someone had gotten ahead of them, either the survivors from the compound or a second element positioned along the river. Bamboo splintered beside her as rounds tore through the raft. Cray screamed and clutched his arm. Villanueva threw himself over Ramos, shielding the wounded man with his own body. Dinah returned fire, shooting at the muzzle flashes, trying to suppress the ambush long enough for the helicopter to reach them. Abraham joined her, his rifle cracking beside hers, the two of them creating a wall of outgoing fire that forced the insurgents to duck and adjust. The helicopter roared overhead and its door gunner opened up, the heavy thump of the mounted weapon drowning out everything else. Tracer rounds streaked down into the tree line, chewing through vegetation, silencing the enemy guns one position at a time. The raft was sinking. Too many holes, too much water pouring in through shattered bamboo. Dinah felt it settling beneath her, the river rising to her knees, her waist. "We have to swim," she shouted. "Get to the far bank." Abraham grabbed Cray, who was bleeding from his arm but still conscious. Villanueva hauled Ramos up and pulled him into the water. Dinah stayed on the disintegrating raft until the others were clear, still firing at the eastern bank, covering their movement. The helicopter dropped lower, its rotor wash whipping the river into chaos. A rescue swimmer hit the water nearby and began pulling Ramos toward a lowering basket. More swimmers appeared, grabbing Villanueva and Cray, dragging them towards safety. Abraham turned back for her. "Sergeant, come on." She fired her last magazine dry and threw herself into the river. The current grabbed her immediately, trying to pull her downstream, but Abraham was there, his hand closing around her wrist, hauling her toward the helicopter's hovering bulk. They broke the surface together beneath the aircraft. Hands reached down and pulled them up, dragging them into the cabin where the hostages were already being treated by a medic. The door gunner was still firing, still suppressing, but the enemy guns had fallen silent. Dinah collapsed against the cabin wall as the helicopter climbed away from the river. Her rifle was empty. Her body was exhausted. Her hands were shaking with the adrenaline that had kept her moving for hours, finally releasing its grip. But they were alive. All of them. Against every odd and every obstacle, they were alive. Abraham sat down beside her, breathing hard, blood from a cut on his forehead mixing with river water on his face. Bad decisions, he said again, and this time she laughed. The field hospital at FOB Kalinaw was chaos when they landed. Medics swarmed the helicopter before the rotors stopped spinning, pulling stretchers toward the cabin, shouting orders and assessments in a language of urgency that transcended words. Ramos was lifted out first, his damaged leg immobilized, and four already running into his arm. Villanueva followed, then Cray with his wounded arm pressed against his chest. Dinah tried to stand and found that her legs would not cooperate. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night had finally drained away completely, leaving behind a body that felt foreign and heavy. She braced herself against the cabin wall and forced herself upright through sheer stubbornness. That was when she noticed the blood. It was pooling beneath her on the cabin floor, dark and spreading, too much to be from the cuts and scrapes she had accumulated during the mission. She looked down and saw the tear in her uniform just above her left hip, the fabric soaked through, the wound beneath it pulsing with each heartbeat. She had been hit during the ambush. She had not even felt it. "Sergeant," Abraham said, his voice suddenly sharp. "You were bleeding." I noticed. Her vision blurred at the edges. The cabin tilted sideways, and she reached for something to hold on to, but her hand closed on empty air. Then Abraham was there, catching her before she fell, shouting for a medic, his face swimming in and out of focus above her. The next minutes came in fragments, hands lifting her onto a stretcher, bright lights passing overhead, voices discussing blood loss and entry wounds and surgical teams, someone cutting away her uniform. The cold sting of antiseptic followed by the deeper cold of something flowing into her veins. She woke in a bed that was not hers, surrounded by white curtains and the steady beep of monitoring equipment. Daylight filtered through canvas walls, painting everything in shades of pale gold. Her mouth tasted like copper and chemicals, and when she tried to move, a sharp pain in her side reminded her why she was there. "Easy," a voice said. "You lost a lot of blood." She turned her head and found Staff Sergeant Tobias Hendricks sitting in a folding chair beside her bed. His arm was in a sling and a bandage covered most of his left ear, but he was alive. She had not known if any of the assault team had survived the firefight until this moment. "The others," she said. Her voice came out as a croak. Hendricks understood what she was asking. "2 killed in action during the initial contact. 4 wounded, including me. The rest made it out when the QRF finally broke through." He paused. "We heard what you did. All of it. The hostages. Ramos is in surgery. The doctors think they can save the leg. Villanueva has a concussion and some cracked ribs, but he will be fine. The contractor, Cray, took a round through the forum. Clean entry and exit. He will be telling that story for the rest of his life." Dinah closed her eyes. For people alive who would not have been if she had followed orders. One person dead who might have survived if they had moved faster, planned better, gotten there sooner. The math of combat never balanced the way you wanted it to. "Garrett Solis," she said. Hendricks nodded slowly. "I know. There was nothing you could have done. He was dead before we even launched. That did not make it easier. It never did." The curtain parted and Captain Vance Driscoll stepped into the small space. He looked like he had not slept in days, his uniform wrinkled, his face drawn and gray. He stood at the foot of her bed for a long moment without speaking, his eyes fixed on some point beyond her, unable or unwilling to meet her gaze. Hendricks started to rise, but Dinah shook her head slightly. Whatever was about to happen needed to happen. Driscoll finally spoke. "The battalion commander wants to see you when you are recovered. There will be paperwork, after-action reports, probably an investigation into why you abandoned your assigned position." "I did what was necessary," Dinah said. "I know." The words hung in the air between them. Driscoll's jaw worked silently, fighting against something internal, some barrier that had stood for years and was only now beginning to crack. "I had someone once," he said, "intelligence officer attached to our unit in Afghanistan. She was smart and capable, and she had no business being in a forward position, but she insisted. I was the operations officer. I could have stopped her. I did not. He swallowed hard. She died because I let her go where she should not have been. Because I did not protect her. Dinah understood then. All the resistance, all the dismissal, all the deliberate sabotage. It had never been about her. It had been about a ghost that Driscoll had been carrying for years, a guilt he had transformed into policy because facing it directly was too painful. What was her name? She asked. Captain Lucia Venn. Driscoll's voice broke slightly on the name. She would have liked you. She was stubborn too. I am sorry you lost her. Driscoll nodded. He still could not look at her directly, but something in his posture had changed. The rigidity was gone, replaced by something that might have been exhaustion or might have been the first stages of letting go. Wait it out there, he said. I would not have believed it if I had not seen the reports. You went into that compound alone against a force that outnumbered you 10-1, and you brought those people home. I did my job. No, you did more than that. He finally met her eyes. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about a lot of things. He did not apologize. Men like Driscoll rarely did, not in words. But the acknowledgement was there, hanging between them, and Dinah recognized it for what it was. Not absolution, not friendship, but perhaps the beginning of something that could eventually become respect. Driscoll left without another word. Hendricks watched him go with an expression that mixed surprise with something like satisfaction. That might be the closest thing to an apology anyone has ever gotten from him, Hendricks said. Dinah leaned back against her pillow and stared at the canvas ceiling. Her side throbbed with each breath. Her body felt hollow and heavy at the same time. But somewhere beneath the pain and exhaustion, she felt something else. She had done what she came here to do. She had proven what she needed to prove. Not to Driscoll or Hendricks or anyone else on this base, but to herself. She was exactly who she had always believed she could be. The monitoring equipment beeped steadily beside her, counting out the rhythm of a heart that had refused to stop beating even when every odd said it should. 3 days passed before Dinah could walk without assistance. The bullet had carved a path through the muscle above her hip, missing anything vital by millimeters, leaving behind a wound that the surgeon said would heal completely with time and physical therapy. She had been lucky. She had also been good. The doctors could not quite decide which mattered more. The FOB had transformed in those 3 days. News of the rescue had spread through official channels and unofficial ones, and by the time Dinah limped out of the field hospital, everyone on base seemed to know her name. Soldiers she had never met nodded as she passed. Philippine Marines stopped to shake her hand. A group of young privates from the logistics company actually applauded when she entered the mess hall for breakfast. She did not know what to do with any of it. Abraham found her sitting alone at a corner table, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate without eating them. He dropped into the seat across from her and set down a cup of coffee that smelled strong enough to dissolve metal. You look terrible, he said. Thank you for noticing. He grinned. I figured you would want an honest assessment. Everyone else around here is too busy treating you like some kind of legend. Dinah sipped the coffee and winced at the bitterness. I did not do anything legendary. I did what anyone would have done. No. Abraham's grin faded into something more serious. You did what you would have done. That is not the same thing. Most people would have stayed at their assigned position. Most people would have followed orders and hoped the assault team figured it out. You made a different choice. She did not have a response to that. The truth was that she had not thought about choices in the moment. She had simply acted, moving on instinct and training and something deeper that she could not name. The analysis came afterward, in the quiet hours when sleep would not come and her mind replayed every decision looking for the ones that could have gone wrong. Corporal Ramos came to see me this morning, Abraham continued. They're flying him to Manila for additional surgery, but he wanted to talk to you first. I told him you were still recovering. What did he say? He said to tell you that he owes you his life. He said his mother would want to thank you personally if you ever visit Zamboanga. Abraham paused. He also said that you are the bravest person he has ever met, and he has met a lot of brave people. Dinah stared at her eggs. Brave was not a word she associated with herself. Stubborn, maybe. Determined. Unwilling to accept outcomes that other people considered inevitable. But brave implied something heroic, something larger than the simple act of refusing to leave people behind. Villanueva was discharged yesterday, Abraha said. He went back to his unit, but he left something for you. He pulled a small object from his pocket and set it on the table between them. It was a patch, worn and faded, the insignia of the Philippine Marine Corps stitched in thread that had once been bright and was now muted by years of service. Dinah picked it up and felt the weight of what it represented. A man did not give away a patch like this lightly. It meant something. It meant everything. Cray flew out on a medical transport this morning, Abraha continued. He asked me to give you his contact information. He said if you ever need anything at all, you should call him. He has connections in the private sector. Said he could get you a job, making 3 times what the Army pays if you ever get tired of this life. Dinah almost smiled. What did you tell him? I told him you were not the type to get tired. She tucked the patch in her pocket and finally took a bite of the eggs. They were cold and flavorless, but she ate them anyway. Her body needed fuel to heal, and she had never been the kind of person who let discomfort stop her from doing what was necessary. The mess hall door opened and Master Sergeant Dale Pickett walked in. He scanned the room until he found her table, then crossed to them with the unhurried stride of a man who had spent decades learning that rushing accomplished nothing. Sergeant Koroma, he said, the battalion commander is ready to see you. Dinah pushed her tray aside and stood, ignoring the pull of pain in her side. She had known this meeting was coming. The official reckoning. The part where someone with rank decided whether what she had done was heroism or insubordination, and whether she would be decorated or disciplined. Abraha started to rise as well, but Pickett shook his head. Just Sergeant Koroma. The specialist can wait here. Abraha looked at her with concern, but she gave him a slight nod. Whatever happened next, she would face it the same way she had faced everything else. On her feet and with her eyes open, she followed Pickett across the FOB, past the Tactical Operations Center where she had been briefed before the mission, past the motor pool where vehicles were being serviced, past the flagpoles where American and Philippine colors hung limp in the humid air. The battalion commander's office was in a prefabricated building near the center of the compound, air-conditioned and quiet, a small island of order in the controlled chaos of military operations. Pickett stopped at the door. For what it is worth, he said, I've been doing this for 24 years. I've seen a lot of soldiers do a lot of things. What you did out there ranks with the best of them. He opened the door before she could respond and gestured for her to enter. Lieutenant Colonel Francine Wakefield sat behind a desk covered in papers and maps and the detritus of command. She was smaller than Dinah remembered from the brief glimpse she had caught during the pre-deployment briefing, but her presence filled the room in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. She looked up as Dinah entered and her expression revealed nothing. Sergeant First Class Koroma, she said, please sit down. We have a great deal to discuss. Lieutenant Colonel Wakefield let the silence stretch for a long moment before she spoke. The air conditioning hummed softly, filling the room with a mechanical whisper that did nothing to ease the tension building in Dinah's chest. I have read the after-action reports, Wakefield said finally. All of them. Captain Driscoll's assessment of the mission. Staff Sergeant Hendrick's account of the firefight. Specialist Abraha's statement regarding his decision to pursue you into the jungle. She paused. I have also read the statements from the 3 surviving hostages. Sergeant Villanueva was particularly detailed in his description of what you did inside that compound. Dinah sat straight in her chair, her hands resting on her thighs, her face carefully neutral. She had learned long ago that the best response to authority was often no response at all. Let them talk. Let them decide. React only when reaction was required. You abandoned your assigned position, Wakefield continued. You proceeded into hostile territory without authorization or support. You engaged an enemy force that outnumbered you by a factor that would have made most soldiers retreat. She leaned forward slightly. Do you have anything to say for yourself? I made a judgment call, Dinah said. The mission was failing. The hostages would have been executed before any relief force could reach them. I assessed the situation and took action. You assessed the situation. Wakefield's tone was unreadable. And your assessment told you that a single soldier could accomplish what an entire assault team could not. My assessment told me that someone had to try. I was the only one in position to do it. Wakefield held her gaze for another long moment. Then, slowly, the corner of her mouth lifted into something that might have been a smile. That is exactly what I would have expected you to say. She opened a drawer in her desk and removed a folder, setting it on the surface between them. Inside were documents that Dinah could not read from her position, official forms and typed pages bearing stamps and signatures. Sergeant First Class Koroma, you are not in trouble. Wakefield's voice softened slightly. What you did was extraordinary, reckless, unauthorized, and completely outside the bounds of your assigned role, but extraordinary nonetheless. 3 people are alive because you refused to accept that the mission had failed. 3 families will see their loved ones again because you made a choice that no one ordered you to make. Dinah felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had not fully acknowledged until it began to release. The Philippine government has formally requested that you receive recognition for your actions, Wakefield continued. So has the American contractor's employer. I have already submitted my own recommendation to division headquarters. She pushed the folder across the desk. You are being put in for the Silver Star. The words landed like physical weight. The Silver Star, the 3rd highest combat decoration the Army could award, given for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. She had seen the medal on the chests of soldiers whose stories had become legend, men and women who had done things that seemed impossible until they proved otherwise. I was just doing my job, she said. No. Wakefield shook her head. You were doing more than your job. That is exactly the point. She stood and moved around the desk, stopping in front of Dinah's chair. When she extended her hand, Dinah rose to take it. I pushed to have you attached to this unit, Wakefield said. There were people who doubted whether you belonged here, whether any woman belonged in a role like this. You have answered that question more definitively than any policy or study ever could. She squeezed Dinah's hand once before releasing it. I am proud to have you under my command. Thank you, Colonel. Wakefield returned to her seat. There will be a ceremony when we rotate back stateside. Medals, speeches, the whole production. I know that it's probably not your preferred environment, but you have earned it. Let people celebrate what you did. Dinah nodded. She did not trust herself to speak. One more thing, Wakefield said. Specialist Abraham also disobeyed orders when he went after you. Technically, I should be recommending disciplinary action. She paused. Instead, I'm putting him in for a Bronze Star. He showed exactly the kind of initiative and loyalty that makes soldiers worth following. You clearly taught him well. He taught himself. I just pointed him in the right direction. Then keep pointing. We need more soldiers like both of you. Dinah left the battalion commander's office and stepped into sunlight that felt different than it had an hour ago. The FOB looked the same, smelled the same, hummed with the same activity it always did. But something had shifted, some internal compass finding a new north. She walked to the edge of the compound where a low wall overlooked the jungle that stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, 12 kilometers through that green maze, was a burned compound and the graves of men who had tried to kill her. Somewhere out, there was the river that had nearly swallowed her whole. She reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 items. Villanueva's patch, worn and faded, carrying the weight of his gratitude, and a photograph, creased and soft from years of handling, showing a 17-year-old boy standing on a porch in Providence, waving goodbye. Her brother's face smiled up at her from the image. She had carried this photo through basic training, through deployments, through every hard moment when she needed to remember why she kept going. He had never gotten to see who she became. He had never gotten to see her prove that the scared girl who left Rhode Island could become something more. I did it, she said quietly. I kept my promise. The jungle did not answer. It did not need to. The silence was enough. If you connected with this story, drop a comment and let us know your favorite part. Or if you know someone who showed hidden courage when everyone doubted them, share their story with us. We would love to hear it. Dinah tucked the photo and the patch back into her pocket and turned toward the mess hall. Abraham would be waiting, probably with more terrible coffee and another joke about bad decisions. Hendricks would want to debrief. There would be reports to file, and wounds to heal, and a long journey home still ahead. But for now, in this moment, she let herself feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Peace. She counted 17 heartbeats before the sound came again. A branch snapping somewhere in the green darkness ahead, maybe 30 meters out, maybe less. Sergeant First Class Dinah Kor-Oma pressed her cheek against the stock of her rifle and let her breathing slow to almost nothing. The jungle had gone quiet around her, the insects and birds falling silent the way they always did when something dangerous moved through their territory. The shape materialized between two trees, low and careful, picking its way through the undergrowth with the patience of a predator. She tracked it through her scope, her finger resting beside the trigger guard, waiting. The shape resolved into a wild boar, tusked and bristling, unaware of the human watching from the shadows. It sniffed the air once, found nothing of interest, and continued on its way. Dinah exhaled slowly and lowered her rifle. 3 days ago, she had been stateside, finishing paperwork at Fort Benning, preparing for a deployment that was supposed to be routine. Joint training exercises with Philippine forces. Advisory role. Low-threat environment. The kind of assignment they gave to soldiers they wanted to showcase without actually risking. Look at what we can do now. Look at who we let carry rifles. She had known it was a test from the moment she received the orders. Everything had been a test since she pinned on her stripes and started pushing against the boundaries that men like Captain Vance Driscoll thought should never be pushed. The memory of their first meeting still burned. She had arrived at FOB Kalinaw 48 hours ago, stepping off a Black Hawk in a heat that wrapped around her like a wet blanket. The forward operating base was smaller than she expected, a collection of prefabricated buildings and reinforced tents surrounded by concertina wire and jungle that pressed against the perimeter like something hungry. Philippine Marines moved between structures alongside American soldiers, the two flags hanging side by side above the Tactical Operations Center. Captain Driscoll had been waiting on the landing pad, tall and lean, with a face that looked like it had been carved from something harder than flesh. He had watched her approach without offering a hand or a greeting. His eyes had moved from her face to the rifle slung across her chest to the sniper qualification badge on her uniform, and something in his expression had hardened even further. Sergeant First Class Kor-Oma, he had said, I want to be clear about something from the start. I did not request you for this mission. I did not want you for this mission. You are here because someone above my pay grade decided to make a point, and I am stuck dealing with the consequences. She had met his stare without flinching. I am here because I am qualified to be here, sir. My record speaks for itself. Your record is paper. Driscoll's voice had carried the weight of something personal, something that went deeper than simple prejudice. Paper does not stop bullets. Paper does not bring soldiers home when everything goes wrong. I have seen what happens when people are put in positions they are not ready for. I will not let that happen again. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have witnessed similar acts of courage where you are from. Dinah had wanted to ask what he meant by again. She had wanted to demand specifics, to challenge the assumption that she was somehow less capable than any other soldier with her training and experience. But she had learned long ago that some battles could not be won with words. Some battles required proof that no argument could provide. I understand your concerns, sir, she had said instead. I intend to address them through my performance. Driscoll had almost laughed. We will see. He had assigned her to a support role that kept her away from the primary operations. Perimeter security, equipment inventory, tasks that any private could handle, designed to keep her visible but useless. She had accepted each assignment without complaint and executed them flawlessly, knowing that he was waiting for her to fail, waiting for the excuse he needed to send her home. Now she lay in the jungle 3 kilometers from base, running a solo reconnaissance patrol that Driscoll had authorized only because Staff Sergeant Hendricks had vouched for her. Hendricks was team leader for the Ranger element attached to the FOB, a quiet man with tired eyes who had watched her shoot during a qualification exercise and said nothing except that she should be on his team instead of counting ammunition in a supply tent. Driscoll had refused, of course, but he had allowed this, a small concession that felt more like a trap than an opportunity. The jungle began to wake around her again, insects resuming their chorus, birds calling warnings to each other in the canopy above. Whatever had silenced them had passed. She checked her position against the landmarks she had memorized and began moving again, flowing through the vegetation like water, finding its path downhill. She was halfway back to the FOB when her radio crackled to life. All elements, all elements. The voice belonged to Hendricks, and something in his tone made her freeze mid-step. We have a situation. Return to base immediately for emergency briefing. This is not a drill. Dinah changed direction and increased her pace. The jungle blurred around her as she moved, branches whipping past, her boots finding solid ground by instinct rather than sight. Something had changed. Something had gone wrong. And somehow she knew, with the certainty that came from years of reading the spaces between words, that whatever waited at that briefing would change everything. The Tactical Operations Center was standing room only when Dinah arrived. American and Philippine soldiers crowded around a central table where maps had been spread and photographs arranged in neat rows. The air smelled of sweat and coffee and the particular tension that preceded combat operations. She found a position near the back wall, close enough to see and hear, but far enough to remain unnoticed. Specialist Yosef Abraha caught her eye from across the room and nodded once. He was young, maybe 23, with the eager intensity of a soldier who had not yet learned that enthusiasm could get you killed. She had been working with him during her supply duties, teaching him small things when no one was watching. How to read terrain, how to control breathing, how to wait. He reminded her of her brother. The thought came unbidden, and she pushed it away. Lieutenant Colonel Francine Wakefield stood at the head of the table, her presence commanding silence without demanding it. She was the battalion commander, a small woman with gray streaking her close-cropped hair and eyes that missed nothing. Dinah had seen her only once before, during the initial deployment briefing, but her reputation preceded her. 22 years of service, combat deployments across 3 continents. One of the highest-ranking female officers in the infantry branch. 6 hours ago, Wakefield began. A Philippine Marine patrol was ambushed approximately 15 kilometers northeast of this position. 4 Marines were killed in the initial contact. 3 were taken prisoner. She tapped one of the photographs on the table. In addition, an American contractor working with Philippine Logistics was captured at a supply depot during a coordinated attack. His name is Garrett Solis, former Marine, 42 years old, 2 children. The room absorbed this information in heavy silence. Dinah studied the photograph of Solis. He had a kind face, the sort that smiled easily, the sort that made you trust him without knowing why. Intelligence has identified the group responsible, Wakefield continued. A splinter cell operating in the southern mountains. They have been linked to kidnappings and executions over the past 18 months. Their pattern suggests that hostages are held for 72 hours before being killed on video and distributed through propaganda channels. She let that sink in before continuing. We have approximately 60 hours before those 4 people die. Philippine forces are mobilizing a response, but their nearest quick reaction element is 12 hours out. We are the closest capable unit. Captain Driscoll stepped forward, his face grim. We have developed a plan for a direct action mission. Assault element will insert via helicopter to a landing zone 4 kilometers from the suspected compound. Ground movement to target. Breach, clear, and extract. He pointed to positions on the map as he spoke, tracing routes and objectives with practiced efficiency. Dinah listened to the plan take shape and felt something cold settle in her stomach. It was solid work, tactically sound, the kind of operation that looked clean on paper. But paper did not account for the 1,000 variables that turned clean plans into chaos. The terrain, the enemy's strength, the possibility that the hostages had already been moved. She watched Driscoll assign roles to the assault team. Hendricks would lead the breach element. For Rangers would provide security. 2 Philippine Marines would serve as guides and interpreters. Every position was filled by soldiers who had trained together, who knew each other's movements and instincts. Sergeant Koroma. Driscoll's voice cut through her thoughts. She straightened. You will provide overwatch from a position on the ridge east of the compound. Long-range support only. You will not engage unless directly threatened or unless the assault team calls for fire support. He paused, his eyes finding hers across the crowded room. Is that understood? She understood perfectly. He was putting her as far from the action as possible while still technically including her in the mission. A sniper position that would likely never fire a shot. A role designed to keep her safe and useless. Understood, sir. The briefing continued, details piling on details, timelines and contingencies and communication protocols. Dinah memorized everything while her mind worked through possibilities that no one else seemed to be considering. What if the compound was more heavily defended than intelligence suggested? What if the assault bogged down? What if the hostages were being held in multiple locations? The meeting ended and soldiers dispersed to prepare their equipment. Dinah remained by the wall, watching Driscoll confer with Hendricks over the map, their voices too low to hear. Abraham appeared at her side. That position he gave you, he said quietly, is 3 kilometers from the compound. You will barely be able to see the target. I know. That is not right. You should be with the assault team. Everyone knows you're the best shot on this base. Dinah turned to look at him. The best shot does not matter if the people in charge do not trust you to take it. She saw the frustration in his face and recognized it as the same frustration she had learned to bury years ago. Listen to me. You do your job. You follow orders. You prove yourself through actions, not arguments. That is how this works. And if that is not enough, then you find another way. She left him standing there and walked to the equipment tent to prepare her gear. Her rifle needed cleaning. Her ammunition needed counting. Her mind needed focus. 60 hours. For lives hanging in the balance. In a position 3 kilometers away, where she would watch through a scope while other soldiers did the work she had trained her entire career to do. She thought about her brother again. 17 years old and full of plans that would never happen. Standing on her mother's porch, waving goodbye, not knowing it was the last time. She had made a promise at his grave. A promise to be brave enough for both of them. Some promises were easier to keep than others. The sun had begun its descent toward the mountains when the helicopters lifted off. Dinah sat in the cabin of the second Black Hawk, her rifle secure between her knees, watching the FOB shrink to a smudge of brown and green against the endless jungle. Beside her, Abraham checked his equipment for the 3rd time, his fingers moving through the familiar motions with nervous energy. He had been assigned to her as a spotter, a concession that Driscoll had granted only after Hendricks pointed out that sending a sniper to an overwatch position alone violated basic tactical doctrine. Dinah suspected Driscoll had agreed because he considered Abraham expendable, a young specialist who had not yet proven his worth. The thought made her jaw tighten. The flight took 20 minutes. They sat down in a clearing carved from the jungle by some long-ago logging operation, the rotors whipping vegetation into a frenzy as the pilots held position just long enough for the assault team to dismount. Dinah and Abraham went last, dropping into knee-high grass and immediately moving toward the tree line while the helicopters climbed away and disappeared over the ridge. The jungle swallowed them whole. Hendricks gathered the assault team for a final check. 8 soldiers in total, faces painted, weapons ready, moving with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this before. He met Dinah's eyes across the huddle and gave her a slight nod. Overwatch position is 2 kilometers northeast, he said. You should be in place within 90 minutes. We will begin our approach at 0200. Radio check every 30 minutes until then. Copy, Dinah said. Hendricks hesitated, then added in a lower voice. Watch yourself out there. Something about this does not feel right. She did not ask what he meant. She had learned to trust the instincts of experienced soldiers, even when those instincts could not be explained. The assault team moved out, flowing into the jungle's single file, vanishing within seconds. Dinah waited until the last sound of their passage faded, then gestured for Abraha to follow. They moved northeast, navigating by compass and terrain features, avoiding trails and open ground. The jungle was different here than it had been during her reconnaissance patrol. Older, denser. The canopy blocked so much light that the forest floor existed in a permanent twilight, populated by shadows that seemed to move when she was not looking directly at them. Abrahas stayed close, matching her pace, his breathing controlled despite the difficulty of the terrain. He was learning. She had seen it in the small improvements over the past weeks. The way he placed his feet now, the way he checked his sectors without being reminded. Given time, he would become a solid soldier. She hoped he would have that time. They reached the ridge as darkness fell completely. The overwatch position Driscoll had selected was technically adequate. It offered a clear line of sight to the compound, visible now as a cluster of lights in the valley below. But the distance was extreme, pushing the limits of even her rifle's effective range. Any shot she took would be affected by wind, humidity, the curvature of the earth itself. Precision would be nearly impossible. She set up anyway. Bipod extended, scope adjusted, body positioned to minimize movement. Abrahas settled beside her with the spotting scope, scanning the compound, calling out details in a whisper. I count 9, maybe 10 targets moving between structures. 2 vehicles parked near the main building. Generator running based on the light patterns. He paused. I cannot see any hostages. They would be inside, probably the largest structure. She studied the compound through her scope, memorizing the layout, tracking movement patterns, identifying potential entry points and defensive positions. The assault team would approach from the west, using a drainage ditch for cover until they reached the perimeter. If everything went according to plan, they would breach the main building, secure the hostages, and extract before the enemy could mount an organized response. If everything went according to plan, the radio crackled. Overwatch, this is assault lead. Radio check. Overwatch copies, Dinah replied. In position. Compound in sight. Estimate 10 enemy combatants visible. Roger. Maintain observation. We are beginning our approach now. The minutes stretched into hours. Dinah watched the compound through her scope until her eyes burned, tracking every movement, noting every change. Abraha maintained his own watch, calling out observations, keeping her focused when fatigue threatened to blur her concentration. At 0143, 17 minutes before the planned breach time, everything went wrong. The first gunshot came from the west, followed immediately by a cascade of automatic fire that shattered the jungle silence. Muzzle flashes strobed through the trees near the drainage ditch where the assault team should have been. Voices shouted in languages she did not understand. More shots. An explosion that sent a pillar of fire climbing toward the stars. They were ambushed, Abrahas said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. Someone knew they were coming. Dinah was already on the radio. Assault lead, this is Overwatch. What's your status? Assault lead, respond. Static answered. Then Hendrick's voice, broken by interference and the sounds of combat. Overwatch, we are pinned. Multiple enemy positions. They were waiting for us. He grunted, and she heard the distinctive crack of rounds passing close to a microphone. We cannot reach the compound. Repeat, we cannot reach the compound. Below, the lights in the compound had changed. Men were running between structures now, grabbing weapons, taking positions. Someone was shouting orders. She watched through her scope as 2 men dragged a hooded figure from the main building and forced them to their knees in the central clearing. They were going to execute the hostages. Right now, while the assault team fought for survival in a drainage ditch half a kilometer away. Dinah made her decision in the space between heartbeats. Overwatch is moving, she said into the radio. I'm going to the compound. Negative, Hendricks shouted back. Negative, stay in position. That is an order. She was already packing her rifle, already moving, her body responding to a calculus that transcended orders and protocols and the careful boundaries that men like Driscoll tried to build around her. Some promises could not wait for permission. Abraham grabbed her arm as she rose. "Sergeant, you cannot go down there alone. That is suicide." She met his eyes in the darkness. "The compound is 2 kilometers away. The assault team is pinned. If I do not move now, those hostages die. Then I'm coming with you." "No." She shook her head firmly. "You stay here. Maintain overwatch. If I need fire support, you are the only one who can provide it." "From this distance? With my rifle?" He gestured at the standard issue M4 slung across his chest. "I cannot hit anything at that range. You could spot for the assault team when they break free. You can relay information. You could do more good here than you can stumbling through the jungle behind me." She pulled her arm free. "That is an order, specialist." Abraham's jaw tightened, but he nodded. The discipline held, even when everything in him clearly wanted to argue. Dinah turned and began her descent. The ridge fell away steeply, forcing her to move in switchbacks, grabbing roots and vines for stability. The sounds of combat echoed through the valley, punctuated by the rhythmic thump of what sounded like a heavy machine gun. The assault team was in serious trouble. She could tell by the pattern of fire, the increasing desperation in the bursts, the way the enemy guns seemed to be closing from multiple directions. She reached the valley floor in 12 minutes, faster than she had any right to expect. The jungle here was thinner, broken by streams and clearings that made movement easier but also more exposed. She stayed in the shadows, flowing from cover to cover, her rifle ready. The compound was visible through the trees now, no longer a distant cluster of lights, but a real place with real walls and real men who wanted to kill her. She counted the guards she could see, 5 on the perimeter. More inside. The central clearing was empty now, the hooded figure she had seen earlier dragged back into the main building. They had not executed anyone yet. There was still time. She circled east, looking for a weakness in the perimeter. The compound had been built with defense in mind, but it was designed to repel a frontal assault, not a single infiltrator. The eastern edge bordered the jungle closely, with only 10 meters of open ground between the tree line and a section of rusted wire fencing. A patrol passed within 15 meters of her position. 2 men, speaking quietly, their rifles held loosely. They were focused on the firefight to the west, on the sounds of their comrades engaging the American assault team. They never looked in her direction. Dinah waited until they disappeared around the corner of a building, then moved. The open ground took her 4 seconds to cross. The wire fence had a gap near one of the posts, poorly secured, wide enough for her body if she moved carefully. She dropped flat and began to work her way through. A thorn of rusted metal caught her sleeve, and she froze, feeling the fabric stretch. One wrong movement, and it would tear, the sound potentially audible to anyone nearby. She controlled her breathing, eased the fabric free millimeter by millimeter, and continued through the gap. Inside the wire now. The thought repeated in her mind like a heartbeat. Inside the wire. No lock-up. No extraction plan. No margin for error. She rose to a crouch and moved along the eastern edge of the compound, staying in the shadows cast by the structures. The generator noise covered her footsteps. The chaos of the distant firefight covered everything else. She was invisible as long as she stayed smart. The main building was 30 meters ahead. Through a window, she could see movement inside, figures passing back and forth, the glow of lanterns casting dancing shadows on the walls. The hostages would be in there. She needed to find a way inside, assess the situation, and figure out how to get 4 people out of a compound filled with armed men who were already on high alert. One problem at a time. She found a position behind a stack of crates near the building's rear entrance. From here, she could see the door, a simple wooden frame with a tarp covering the opening. One guard stood beside it, smoking a cigarette, his rifle leaning against the wall within arm's reach. He looked bored and tired, a man pulling duty he considered beneath him. Dinah set down her rifle and drew her knife. The guard never heard her approach. She was behind him before he finished exhaling his last drag, her blade finding the gap between his body armor and his collar. He slumped against the wall, and she caught him, easing him to the ground, positioning his body to look like he had simply sat down to rest. She retrieved her rifle and slipped through the tarp. The interior of the building was a single large room divided by hanging sheets and stacked equipment. Voices came from a far end, raised an argument. She could not understand the words, but the tone was clear. They were debating what to do about the attack. Some wanted to execute the hostages immediately. Others wanted to wait. The disagreement was buying time, but not much. She moved through the space, clearing corners, checking shadows. The hostages had to be here somewhere. A muffled sound drew her attention. A cough, followed by the rattle of chains. She followed the noise to a corner of the building where a sheet had been hung to create a makeshift cell. She pulled the sheet aside and found them. 3 figures sat against the wall, hooded and bound. A fourth lay motionless on the ground, his hood removed, his eyes staring at nothing. Garrett Solis, the American contractor, dead. Dinah felt the grief hit her like a physical blow. She had been too slow. Despite everything, despite abandoning her position and crossing 2 kilometers of hostile jungle, she had still been too late for one of them. But 3 were still breathing. 3 could still be saved. The voices at the far end of the building grew louder. Footsteps approached. Dinah pressed herself against the wall, raised her rifle, and waited for whatever came next.